All righty. Good afternoon. Hope everyone had a good lunch and or afternoon. Yeah, that. We are in the book of Luke this evening, and we are continuing on in our study. We have gone through a little bit of the first chapter, kind of looking at John. As we're thinking about Luke, or the book of Luke, what was some information about him that we pulled out that anybody, if anybody remembers that? What are some things about Luke that might help us in our study as we go through the book? Okay, he was a physician. So whenever we think about a physician, we think about how usually detailed their work is going to be. And we can see that in his writing. We can see a lot of the words that he uses. We'll see that here in a minute about one of the words that he uses. He's the only one that uses it in the book of Luke and in the book of Acts. Anything else from Luke or about Luke? He was not a Jew, right? He was a Greek-speaking convert. And what about that can we use in our study for Luke? If a Greek-speaking convert is writing to a group of people, do you think it's going to be a Jewish audience? Would Jews listen to anybody who was a Greek or a Gentile? What was their mindset about the Gentiles? Right. We are Abraham's seed. You were not. You were pretty much dirt, or lower than dirt. Right, and that's one of the conflicts that Paul deals with in the book of Romans there in the first couple of chapters, that division, that mindset attitude between the two groups of people. But Luke is a Greek-speaking convert, and he is writing to a Greek convert audience. And that goes into play whenever he deals with the Jewish traditions, whenever he deals with the Jewish feast or anything that has to do with the Jews. We see that in chapter 1 with Zacharias and Elizabeth, right? They were of the tribe of Levi, of this certain division. They had this certain thing that they did, rotating through their worship service. I mean, very detailed. He's got like 20 different verses for explaining what they were doing, right? Anything else from Luke? He wrote the book of Acts, right? So we have this complementary book you can go to, this timeline, if you would, from Luke into the book of Acts. He has this timeline from Jesus' birth, or right before Jesus' birth, to the beginning of the church. And as you read Luke, you see the end there, and it moves straight into the book of Acts. So that's an interesting thing whenever you're studying Luke, is knowing the next book you probably should study is the book of Acts. Anything else? All right, thinking about our main verse in Luke. What was the main verse that we need to remember from the book, at least in the first chapter? What is Luke's purpose? Why is he writing? That we may know the certainty of the things that we are instructed. That we can have the full confidence in what Christ has done for us from this book. That's his goal, that's his purpose, is for Theophilus. That was his immediate purpose, but his ultimate purpose was for everybody to be able to have this information written down so that we can know with certainty what Christ has done for us. And he starts all the way back even before, I believe Matthew doesn't even start as far back as Luke does. Again, Matthew is talking to a Jewish audience, and he starts off with the genealogy, going all the way back to Abraham, because that was their mindset, right? I'm a child of Abraham, I have salvation, all that good stuff. Luke goes all the way back to this prophecy of John the Baptist. As we think about our outline for Luke, verses 1 through 4 of chapter 1 is the setting or the preface. This is what he's writing about. And as we go into these next couple verses, if you want to go ahead and click that, we have this proclamation of the king. And this is broken down into two sections. Proclamation of the forerunner and then proclamation of the king himself. So we have this proclamation of the forerunner, chapter 1, verses 5 through 25, talking about John the Baptist. And thinking about Luke and why he is writing, why does he start off with the forerunner rather than the king?
Because the forerunner would prepare the way, so it would make sense in reading it to start out that way.
Chronologically, a forerunner comes before the king. So Luke is very precise in his writing. There are Old Testament references, prophecies about this forerunner. Right? What were some of the Old Testament prophecies about the forerunner for Christ? Anybody remember that from last class? The voice of the one crying in the wilderness, right? That was Isaiah. He is going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, right? So there's a couple different Old Testament references that Luke is writing about that God is fulfilling in John the Baptist. So he's not just some random person that John's throwing out there. This man is going to be very important in Christ's ministry. Thinking about, and he's going to go further into this in a couple chapters over, chapter 3. When he's actually preparing the way, when he's actually doing his mission. He's just setting up for Christ's ministry. Okay, we have this proclamation of the forerunner, and hopefully we'll get into proclamation of the king here in a little bit. Last class, I believe we got down into verse 17. So we're going to pick up, let's kind of review what's happening. What is Zacharias doing in this first couple verses 5 through 17? What is he doing? He's going to serve in the temple, and then what happens? There's an angel inside waiting for him, right? That was, God hasn't spoken to his people in 400 years. And all of a sudden, there's an angel waiting to give good tidings, we'll get to this in a second, to a Jewish person. He is going to talk to his people again. And we talked about kind of the prophecy back in Malachi chapter 4, and another one dealing with Elizabeth, Zacharias, and their names, how God is remembering his promise to bring a Savior. That leads us into verse 18. 18 through, let's do 20. Zacharias said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." Let's kind of stop there. Why is he bringing up this idea of being old in years, and what is he doing? Okay, we have going back all the way to Abraham, right? Both Zacharias and Elizabeth are older, well past childbearing years, right? And you have this angel telling Zacharias, "You're going to have a son." Hold up, who has a question, right? I probably would. Zacharias is questioning this message from God, as most people would. The interesting thing is what happens next. In verse 19, the angel answered and said to him, "I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and was sent to speak to you and bring you these good tidings. But behold, you will be mute and not able to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their own time." Thinking about going all the way back to Abraham, what did Sarah do when she heard she was going to have a son? She laughed. Who here wants to laugh in God's face? All Zacharias did was pose a question. And what does he get from it? He doesn't get to speak anymore. Right? That's weird. Going back to this idea of being mute, though, it was interesting kind of looking up. There is another event in time. There's another book that has this idea of God making somebody mute. Does anybody know where God makes this person mute? Or who this character, Old Testament, God makes somebody mute?
I beg your pardon?
God is going to make another person in the Old Testament mute, and it only happens one other time. Does anybody know that character? This is Ezekiel. Ezekiel, very good, very tough book to go through. But Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 26, God is going to make him mute for quite a lot of the book. I know. Ezekiel 3 and verse 26. I will make your tongue cling to the roof of your mouth so that you shall be mute and not be able to rebuke them. And they are, for they are a rebellious house. Anybody know the context and what's happening with Ezekiel? When Ezekiel is prophesying? Ezekiel is prophesying during the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people. You have Daniel being the prophet of in the king's castle or in the king's court, and then you have Ezekiel prophesying to the Israelites. Same time period, two different people. But God calls them a rebellious house. He's trying to encourage the people to come back to God, and God makes them mute. We go over to Ezekiel chapter 24. Ezekiel chapter 24. Starting in verse 25. And you, son of man, will it not be the day when I take from them their stronghold, their joy and their glory and their desire of the eyes, and that on which they set their minds, their sons and their daughters, that on that day one who escapes will come to you and let you hear it with your ears. On that day your mouth will be open to him who has escaped. You shall speak and no longer be mute. Thus you will be a sign to them, and they shall know that I am the Lord. Why has God made this person mute in the book of Ezekiel?
It's a miracle to prove that God has power, God has control.
So that they know that God is who he says he is. God has not talked to his people back over in the book of Luke for 400 years. A single person goes in to burn incense for this hour of prayer. He's in the temple by himself, and he comes out not being able to speak. He's not going to be able to speak for 9 months until his baby is born. And then whenever his baby is born, he's going to be able to speak again. That's very powerful to the people. Very powerful in the book of Ezekiel, because this man isn't going to be able to speak for a while. But in the context of chapter 24, that person who escapes is coming from Jerusalem saying that the temple has been taken. And then this mute man is able to speak again. The people around them is going to be able to know that that statement of Jerusalem falling is true because of this man being able to talk. God's power being shown in this man. Ezekiel chapter 33. God doesn't just do things for the fun of it, right? There's usually a reason behind it. Zacharias is being made mute for a purpose. It almost seems like a rebuke to Zacharias for his question, though. Ezekiel chapter 33, 21. And it came to pass in the 12th year of our captivity, in the 10th month, on the 50th. Can't even read. On the 5th day of the month, that one who had escaped from Jerusalem came to me and said, "The city has been captured. Now the hand of the Lord had come upon me the evening before the man came who had escaped, and he had opened my mouth. So when he came to me in the morning, my mouth was opened, and I was no longer mute." God is using these men as signs for the people so that they know what's happening. They should know, they should understand what is going on. For 400 years, these people have been looking and longing for something, and what was that? They were looking and seeking for the Messiah. And now this man comes out of the temple not being able to speak. Back in Luke chapter 1, let's continue reading on, verse 21. And the people waited for Zacharias and marveled that he lingered so long in the temple. But when he came out, he could not speak to them. And they perceived that he had seen a vision in the temple, for he beckoned to them and remained speechless. So it was as soon as the days of his service were completed that he departed to his own house. Now after these days his wife Elizabeth conceived, and she hid herself 5 months, saying, "Thus the Lord has dealt with me, and the days when he looked on me, to take away my reproach among the people." So why is Luke writing about John, the proclamation of the forerunner? What significance do the people get from this section? There's a prophecy being fulfilled right in front of them. There is a man who has been miraculously made mute right in front of them. That should click on their brain that God is doing something and that they need to be preparing for something, because what happens after the forerunner? The king shows up, right? So their mind should already be waiting for and preparing for the king. Does this matter for a Gentile people? We got a couple head shakes, no. But this wasn't just for the Jewish people, right? This idea of the forerunner wasn't just for a Jewish nation. This was any nation that had a king. They usually had somebody going beforehand. So when a Gentile is reading of somebody going beforehand, they understand and know that there is a king coming. And what's the next section we get into? The proclamation of the king, right? And what's different about this proclamation of a king than any other proclamation? This is a virgin birth. Something that does not happen because it physically cannot happen. And yet we have the proclamation of our king here in verse 26. Thinking about the end here of Elizabeth and what she says. After they left, she conceived a child, and she hid herself for 5 months, saying, Thus the Lord has dealt with me, and the days when he looked on me, to take away my reproach among people. Why would that be a statement Elizabeth makes?
People thought it was something that she'd done wrong to be barren. God had punished her.
Right?
But it not been punishment. In fact, it was used to bring glory to God.
Right. There's this idea in their culture that childbearing, if you could not bear a child, that was God acting against you. Because you have done something wrong, you have sinned against him, something of the sort. Right? Is that what happens, though? Right? A lot of people are barren today. Is that because God has punished that person for sinning? No, because sometimes they're barren from birth. I mean, it's unfortunate, and a lot of women struggle with that. This idea of God taking away the reproach, and she doesn't say among him, but among the people, right? This was something that might be this idea of disgraceful amongst the people if you weren't able to bear a child. Let's think about the Jewish culture. The Jewish culture for a minute. Where was the Messiah coming from? What tribe was the Messiah coming from? Judah, right? So let's take a woman from Judah. If a woman from Judah was not able to bear a son, what might be going through her mind? I'm not going to be able to bring the Messiah. That's what use do I have? What about a woman from Levi? What were the Levites for? They were priests, right? This is a woman she cannot bear fruit and carry on the lineage for the priesthood. That might be very devastating for someone, right? This emotion, thinking about all the emotion that these women might have from not bearing children. You think about today, women either not wanting to or thinking of childbirth as the man having bondage or something over women. And it's not so. God doesn't use childbirth as a bondage for women. What is childbirth for? Why did God give us the ability to repopulate?
Multiply, fill the earth.
Right? Whenever we go all the way back into the book of Genesis, God says to spread out and multiply and fill the earth. Why?
Because they were all gone, except Noah and his family.
Okay, we go back to Noah, and I mean, there was 8 of them, so you had to repopulate somehow. Why are we even here? I'm sorry, hang on. Teach other about Christ. Seek and save the lost. Ultimately, it is to glorify God, right? We have an entire population of the world. Most people don't believe in God, but why are we here? Why go and bring forth children into this world? Okay, we could spread the gospel with it. What about showing His power in childbirth? Being able to bring forth a whole human being from, it almost seems like nowhere, right? What is it, 2 cells come together and make 4, and they just multiply, and bam, there's a whole human 9 months later. That's amazing, right? That is something amazing, and these people, they took advantage of that. They knew that God was almighty and powerful just from childbirth. And today's culture, they just throw it out the window. So that's something interesting to think about. Whenever you think about this word, looked upon, this is the word that I mentioned earlier that Luke uses specifically. He is the only one in the New Testament that uses it. You can also see it in Acts 4:29, whenever Peter and the people there are praying for boldness after they are imprisoned. But this idea of being looked upon or taking away the reproach or this idea of disgrace, I have over in Genesis 30:23, we don't have to turn there, but there's another woman who was also barren who says a similar idea whenever she hears that she is going to receive a child, and that is Rachel, Jacob's wife. He had 2 wives and 2 wife maidservants, and Rachel, time after time, again trying, could not bear a child. And then whenever she hears that she's going to bear a child, she says a similar idea of that God has looked upon me and has taken away my reproach. I'm just going to turn there and read that. Because I thought it was interesting. Genesis 30:22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her, and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. All right. Thinking about verse 22, God hearing, God knowing, God understanding what you're going through and answering your prayers is something that Luke is going to deal a lot with prayers. Questions, comments, and concerns about the forerunner? Yes, sir.
Just gonna say, she said, God looked upon me. In other words, he knows who I am, he knows my condition. He chose me.
Mm-hmm. Right. God, right. Thinking about Elizabeth in this instance, God has looked upon me. God has chosen me specifically to do this for. What does that say about God? Is he passive in what he's doing here? Did he just set a clock, wind us up, and threw us out into the oblivion? A lot of people believe that nowadays, that God just set us up. Even though they believe in God, they just have this weird concept that he wants nothing to do with us and just pushed us away. But this idea that God is watching, God is looking upon his people, and God cares for his people. Very good.
You see it very, very much in the fact, I mean, you can think of Sarah, and you can think of Elizabeth, where we think of any, the coming of a child as being a marvelous, wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of Elizabeth and Sarah, God suspended the natural laws. It was the miraculous that, for they were past the time. So we see God's greatness in that, and then, of course, going on to Mary, an even greater miracle, because there was the natural laws was suspended even further in that. And so it all reminds us of the great power of God
Right.
through all of that.
Right. If you didn't hear, Chris, just the idea of God's power in these two areas of John's birth and how he suspended the natural of the years to be able to have a child. And you go into Mary, and even more so with a virgin giving birth. God is suspending this, the laws of physics and the law of nature, so that he can show his power. Absolutely wonderful. Excellent idea.
We see throughout the Bible, and thinking back to Moses, from the burning bush all the way to escalation up to the parting of the Red Sea, we see the glory of God and the miracles that he works escalating ever so much through the history of the Bible, from that to the suspension of the natural order from the age of birth versus the virgin birth, from Jesus' miracles from turning water to wine all the way up to Lazarus. So,
Right. Right. This idea of God kind of showing this escalation of power, and he goes back to the book of Exodus where he's dealing with the burning bush all the way up until the parting of the Red Sea, even so with Christ and how you have the virgin birth and you have Jesus turning water to wine, all the way escalating up until the resurrection of Lazarus and ultimately the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
it's almost like, if you don't believe me now, watch what comes next.
Right.
If you didn't believe that, we'll see what comes next.
Right. Playing off that, a lot of people, you see it with the Pharisees, and they keep asking for another sign and another sign. If somebody was dead right in front of us and just raised from the dead, you would hope and think that that would click something pretty quickly, right? Or if somebody has been paralyzed for their entire life is now walking around with their bed, you would think something should be going on. And yet they were asking for another sign, another miracle, and another wonder, right? Just the two different mindsets of I want to know and seek after God, or I want to be on the top, and it doesn't matter what you're going to show me. So, yes, ma'am.
I wonder if Elizabeth did not know what happened until she conceived, because Zacharias couldn't speak. He'd go home like play this mad game of charades or write it down. I mean, because he was so excited and he couldn't talk. Like that
Right.
was being madly.
Yeah, that's wild to think about Elizabeth not knowing until, almost probably a month into it.
That's not on the list.
Right. Yeah. So God is going to use Zacharias as a sign to the people. He's going to use him being mute, and then later, whenever the child is born and named, is when he's able to talk again. And I think Luke talks about that here in the next couple verses. But he's going to use Zacharias as a sign for the people. Moving on into the proclamation of the king. He switches transitions, and Luke is going to pair a lot of his ideas, and you can see it a lot in the first chapter. So he's going to have two proclamations. Next, he's going to have two praises, and then he's going to have a prophecy there at the end of chapter 2. But he usually couples his ideas in duplicates, maybe even sometimes three parts. And that is for our benefit so that we can know and understand, especially in that day and age, you had to have witnesses of the mouth of 2 or 3, and he's going to have 2 or 3 examples just verifying what he's talking about. So we have the proclamation of the forerunner, we'll move into the proclamation of the king, and we'll kind of compare the two whenever we get into it. Verse 26. Now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth. The 6th month of what? First of all, I read this today and I was like, what is he even talking about? Whose pregnancy? Elizabeth's pregnancy, right? Mary's not pregnant yet. So we go back up a verse or two, and it says that for 5 months Elizabeth hides herself. Now in the 6th month of that, Gabriel goes over and visits Mary in Nazareth. What's significant about Nazareth? That's another prophecy in the Old Testament, right? So we know that. All right, verse 27. To a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And having come in, the angel said to her, Rejoice, highly favored one, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women. Let's kind of stop there. Let's kind of compare kind of what's going on between this instance of Gabriel and the last instance. What are some contrasts or comparisons just from these couple verses? Who did he talk to in the first one? Talk to a man in the first one, right? Why doesn't he go to Joseph in the second one? Not married, not the father, right? He's talking to a woman. First of all, in that culture, what were women basically? Lower than servants usually, lower than the slave. I don't want to be too vulgar, but a lot of cultures viewed them as glorified incubators. That's pretty much how men viewed women in these older cultures. That speaks a lot about God and His power, His what am I looking for? Talks a lot about the inspiration of the Bible, because if it was just men writing, what probably would have they left out in the first century? Probably anything to do with glorifying women. You see a lot in the book of Luke. Women are going to be glorified and exalted, starting out with Mary. Okay. Anything else? Any other comparison from the two instances of Gabriel meeting Zacharias and Mary? What about what he says? What does Gabriel say to Zacharias? Don't be afraid, right? And what does he say to Mary? Don't be afraid, right? He says to rejoice, highly favored one. If you were a young woman and an angel comes up to you and tells you this statement, again, who is Mary? Again, God hasn't talked to His people in 400 years. She's a descendant of David. She's not married, right? She hasn't done married things. And an angel just shows up and says, rejoice, highly favored one. What's going through her mind? Uh-oh. Confusion. Hopefully at this point, he says to rejoice, so hopefully in her mind, I don't know about right now, but later she might have some rejoicing she can do. Okay? Did you have your hand up? I'll come back to you.
I was gonna say, in the case of Zacharias, he was preparing him for what was about to happen, because they were married, but
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't supposed to be possible for them to have a child. And with Mary, he's preparing her for something that is basically not supposed to happen.
Right.
She said, how can this be since I know no man?
Right. And we'll get to that here whenever we come to it. But God is preparing Zacharias because they were married. I mean, they weren't supposed to have children, but they can now. And in the instance with Mary, he's preparing Mary for what's about to happen. So the very interesting contrast there. And then right here, did you have something?
Based off of her reaction later in the song she sings, I think that she's also probably very humble. She seems to have a very godly heart from the beginning. And even though she's full of wonder, it seems that she's also just, I would imagine she's very humbled to be chosen by God for such a service.
Yeah. Alex, jumping forward to the Song of Mary over in verse 46, thinking about she might have some humility come in whenever she hears about this childbirth, right? Yes, ma'am.
Do we even know, do we just assume that Mary and Joseph were? Did they know?
In Matthew, it says that they were betrothed.
Well, in verse 27, it says, betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph.
So she was engaged?
Yes, she is engaged. Yes, Mary is engaged to Joseph. And that kind of plays into why they had to hide for a while, because in that culture, if you become pregnant outside of marriage, yeah, bye-bye. Yeah, it didn't look good for you, it didn't look good for your husband, it didn't look good for your family. It was a very dishonorable, disgraceful thing for a woman to be childbearing outside of marriage. So, thinking about Joseph and what he was going through his mind, because I don't remember if it was Gabriel or God, but God has to talk to Joseph and let him know it's okay. This is from me. She wasn't unfaithful to you. Okay? Yes, sir.
You think about how this would be something that Mary would always be able to come back to during those difficult years because of what it looked like to everybody else and how they'd have looked down on her. And she knew people would be talking behind her back, but she knew through it all, she's highly favored by the Lord.
Right. This is something that Mary can look back on whenever she's going through these difficult times. What do you think her mother might have thought of her whenever she became pregnant? Right? What do you think her family would have thought of her? What do you think the city or the culture thought of her? That's probably what's racing through her mind most of the time. But she's able to point back to God saying, you are a highly favored one. You are highly favored in my eyes.
Just going into more depth with that, whenever she accepts this, she's essentially signing herself up for a life of being ostracized.
Mhm.
For the rest of her life, anybody who knows of Jesus' birth, anytime she tries to explain, oh yeah, sure, an angel told you, God came to you, right? That's what happened. There until really he began his ministry, and in some cases even never. But I mean, for many people, until his ministry started, she would have been seen as little more than a harlot.
Yep.
And she was accepting that because God saw her as highly favored.
Right. Her acceptance of what God is going to do for her, even in the face of cultural persecution of basically being called a harlot because of being childbearing before marriage, and yet she is called highly favored one. Verse 29. But when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and considered what manner of greeting this was. When the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there will be no end." Okay, what's kind of going on in this section? Right, we have her response. Right, what's her response to seeing this angel and hearing what he has to say? Right. Yeah, her response in the next section, verse 34, is, "How can this be?" Right, and what was Zacharias' response to Gabriel? How can this be? Right, we're old and we can't have children. What did God do to Zacharias? He turned him off. Right, he shut his vocal cords off for a minute. What does he do for Mary? Yeah, he's going to comfort her, and we'll read that here in a minute. Okay? Just some contrast between the two. Why he does it, I don't know. It could be the way they ask their questions. It could have just, I don't know why.
It doesn't reveal much to us, but if you look back, it almost had to be, in the attitude.
Yeah.
Like Rachel, like Sarah and Abraham.
Right. Right, we can't say for certain, but probably it could have been his attitude going back to Abraham and Sarah laughing in his face, right? How can this be?
Could it be because he's a priest and he should have more knowledge of things like that happening compared to Mary?
Yeah, that very well could be. Him being a priest, right? The Levites should know the law, right? They should have known what God has done for them, right? That's a very good possibility. I hadn't thought of that.
I was just thinking it's a difference talking to an older gentleman and a young lady. This
Okay,
is a young
right.
lady who's not married. This is an older priest who's beyond
Right.
father in years.
Could.
I mean,
right.
that could have something that, you don't want to make this young girl cry. You know, I mean, I know
Right.
it's an angel, but
It could have very well been their age, looking at their maturity, right?
And I could be wrong here, but to me it seems like Zacharias is almost questioning him, like, how is this? And to her, with her, it seems like she's troubled, like she's just confused, like not so much that she's questioning it, she's just perplexed or confused about the situation.
Right.
Like his is almost disbelief in a way, and she's just a little bit confused.
Right. It could very well be disbelief versus confusion. We think about Job's questioning God, right? It wasn't out of disbelief, it was wanting to know, right? So you have that switch there.
This is all speculation, but it also could have been that she could have been afraid already, thinking about what people may think of her before she comes, and so kind of afraid. What do you mean?
Right. It could very well be the cultural aspect of her already thinking about how could this be. Very well could be that. Again, we don't know. Scripture doesn't say. All of it was speculation, but here we are. Yes, ma'am.
Well, this is not really related just to the lesson, but even today, a young woman who finds herself with a child, she sometimes gets an abortion. And I'm just thinking, what if Mary had that attitude?
Yep. What if the angel didn't come to Mary? She didn't know what was going on, and she had the attitude of what we have today and just got rid of the child before it even came out, right? Terrible to think about, especially nowadays, but it happens a lot today. So, all right. Anybody else?
Well, and we think too about it, when you look at what Zacharias is told back in verse 13, he's told very clearly, your prayer is heard. I doubt that Mary was praying for a child at this point. I mean, down the road, yes, but just something also to factor in there. And
Okay.
that's something, whether or not he and Elizabeth, they probably weren't still praying for it,
Right.
but something that they had prayed for in the past.
Yeah.
And everything there.
Yeah, very good possibility of Zacharias. Zacharias had been praying for a child, and then all of a sudden this angel says you're going to have a child, and then just, oh, well, disbelief out of that part. Mary, 16, 15, 18, somewhere in 17? I don't know, young, right? Probably not married, right? She's not married. Probably wasn't praying for a child at the moment, right? So you have that different aspect there going with the two.
Also, Zacharias being a priest, having had the writings, he should know that nothing's impossible with God.
Right.
But with Mary, she, this is not supposed to happen.
Right.
How's it gonna happen? Because I don't know.
Right. Going back to that idea of him being a Levite and should have known the law, he would have known about Sarah. He would have known about Rachel and how God was able to make this happen. Right? Whereas Mary, have we read of a virgin birth other than this one happening right here? Right? This has not happened. This did not happen before, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't happened since. Right? So it could very well be that aspect of this has not happened and it will never happen. How can this be? Type of question, right? Let's see here. Do not be afraid. That's usually the angel's response to anybody that they show themselves to. If you ever see an angel and they don't say that, it's probably not an angel, because they are probably very terrifying to look at. But looking at this idea of finding favor in God, who is the last person do we see finding favor with God in Scripture?
Christ grew in favor with
That hadn't happened, right?
God.
Yeah, that hadn't happened yet, though, right?
It's the last one before this.
Daniel. Yeah.
Ask the question again.
Where have we seen someone finding favor with God before this?
Hannah,
Noah, Hannah, right? My idea went back to Noah. I didn't think about Hannah. I don't even remember where that's at. First Samuel? Samuel found favor. Where was the Samuel one? First Samuel 2:26, and the child Samuel grew in stature and in favor both with the Lord and man. That goes back to your statement about Christ growing in favor with man and God. But my thought went back to Noah finding favor in the eyes of God, going all the way back to the flood. That was a pretty big change in the world, right? Thinking about what's happening right now. What is about to happen? There's going to be a huge change. There is a huge change coming, right? The first one, everybody but 8 people died. This one, what's happening? Everybody has the chance for salvation. That's a huge change. What was the Jewish mindset? It's just Abraham's seed. This is a huge change coming for the world because of what God is doing for his people. God has found favor with Mary and is bringing forth the virgin birth so that we can be saved. And thinking about why Luke is writing it is so that we can have the confidence to be able to go and preach that. This evening, the invitation is open to those who have been struggling, whether it is mentally, physically, or spiritually. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, that is what the church is here for. It is to help you, pray for you, study with you. If you haven't become a baptized believer, now's the time. Why wait? Why waste the time of salvation? Why chance it for tomorrow? The invitation is open to those who need it. Let us come forward now as we stand and as we sing.